And today we have the pleasure of having Laurent Lehmann, who's going to talk about his paper, The Evolution of Environmentally Mediated Social Interactions Under Isolation by Distance and Selection for Posthumous Spite. Laurent, the floor is all yours.
Okay, so thank you very much, Peter, Eric, and Christophe for having me today for this lecture seminar series. And this is, I will present a model which is based on a paper, a working paper with Charles Mulon and Jorge Peña. So in case the paper is on Charles' website here. And sorry, so the starting point of this paper, which basically develops a model, is the observation, maybe the trivial observation, that organisms, they inevitably interact with conspecifics and members of other species. But such interactions, they can in fact be divided in two types. Essentially, you can have direct interaction with other individuals from the same or other species. You can groom them, or you can fight, so that the interaction is in a sense direct, or it can also be indirect, mediated by some environmental state variable or physical state variable. This is typically the case if we eat resources, we are removing resources for the system, and that reduces resources available to others. So in a sense, we have an effect on others. Or we can drive a car, emit pollutants in the air, and so that may feed back on other individuals in the population. And this is what I mean by environmentally mediated social interactions, because the interactions, they are not direct, but they go through some state variable that feedbacks then on the population. And the objective of this talk is to present a model that derives a measure for the convergent stability of a quantitative trait. A quantitative trait is a trait that belongs to the real numbers in a spatially structured population. So this is really, in a sense, an evolutionary game theory model where traits are affected by genes, and we want to understand what are the attractor points of the evolutionary dynamics. And another objective of this model is actually to understand conditions for the selection on spites. By spite, biologists mean actually a strong spite, which is a behavior that is really costly to an individual in terms of survival and reproduction. And when you affect the environment, there may be conditions actually where you feedback negatively on the survival and reproduction of individuals on the future. And we want to understand under what conditions such behavior can evolve and that are costly today. So this is a kind of extreme form of a behavior. You pay a cost, you reduce your survival or your production like a kamikaze, but you harm the future of the population. So in a sense, I'm not so much, it's not that I'm fond of harming or spite, but I think it's interesting to understand how selection shapes such behavior, because it provides a limit on what natural selection can do. And to some extent, the objective of modeling is to understand the limits of certain processes and phenomena. So let me go into some more details about what I just said. So imagine you have a population of individuals and they interact with some environmental variable here. So the environmental variable, I depicted it as green, so it could be like grass in a population. So you have animals or herbivores that eat the grass. And what we will be interested in is in situation where we have some payoff that is accruing to an individual. Here, this individual I here that expresses trait Zi when others in its neighborhood express average trait Z minus I bar. And then the payoff to the individual may also depend on the amount of grass, so on the value of the state variable, where the trait of the individual, the average trait among others in the population, and the state variable all belong to the reals. And the payoff is a mapping from this population state or environmental state to real number. And so what the biologist means by a payoff, it's something that has a currency and that should have some clear measure that you can clearly measure. And I think what we like to think about payoff, that's basically energy you extract from the environment. So energy, the unit of measurements of payoff, they are basically calories or joules. And so energy allows you to make work. And as a consequence of the behavior of individuals, of the expression of the traits, that can affect the dynamics of the state variable. The amount of grass tomorrow, that may depend on the amount of grass today and the average behavior of individuals in the population, basically the average trait value ZI, where we have a dynamic map that maps the population state, the present population state, to the value of the environmental variable tomorrow. So this is basically what I mean by by socially mediated interaction, is this fact that the payoff of an individual may depend on its own traits, that of individuals in the population, and the environmental state variable, which itself is affected by the past behavior of individuals. So the interaction here, when they are mediated through the state variable, they are indirect. Okay, this of course.
Can I ask? Sorry, can I
Yes.
ask a question about notation? So
Yes.
what is Z bar I? Since why is there an I index there?
So this is because the difference. This good question. ZI, let's say it's my phenotype. That's the phenotype of the individual. Z minus I, it's the average phenotype among the neighbors of an individual. ZI bar, it's the average phenotype of everybody. So when you interact with others, the payoff depends on your behavior, the behavior of others, and the state variable. But the state variable, it's affected by everybody in the population, right? Because we all eat grass.
So my question is, why do I need I in the notation? Is it about a particular neighborhood, or is it about everybody in the population?
That was just notation will change. That was like to emphasize that I have three, because the model will become more complex later. That was just to emphasize that we have the trait of an individual, the average trait among the neighbors, and the average trait among everybody. That's the important concept.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, so this framework is of course not new. In a sense, if you open a game theory book or a book of optimal control theory, you have full of such type of models all over the places, and often the traits will be strategies, and then the goal is somehow to find a Nash equilibrium such that a stream of payoff is maximized. So the models we have in mind, they are not like this. So maybe they connect a little bit like this, but they are different, because the models we have in mind is a situation where the dynamics of the state variable, that occurs through generation. So in a sense, you have the time is demographic time. And so individuals, they may die, and they have an effect on the state variable in the next over the next generation. And so that means our models, they connect to standard evolutionary invasion analysis, where typically the fitness of an individual is of a mutant individual in a resident population is written in terms of these payoffs, and where the idea is to look at the growth rate of a mutant trait in a resident population, where the resident population is at an equilibrium of this dynamic state variable that I just specified. And so our models, they will be more of this flavor. So they will be different than the standard game theory models. So in a sense, the story in evolutionary biology is that you have an environment that is affected by the individual. It's at an equilibrium, and this equilibrium affects your payoff, and your payoff affects your fitness. So basically, you have a mapping from payoff energy calories to number of babies produced, which defines your fitness. And with this, we can define a growth rate, a geometric growth rate of the spread of a mutant. We put a mutant in the population, and this measure will tell us whether the mutant will increase or decrease in frequency. And a convergence stable trait value, it's basically defined as a trait value where the derivative of payoff with respect to the mutant strategy vanishes. So the idea is that the trait value that should be favored by natural selection are those that increase fitness, and here those that increase payoff, and through the input of mutations that are rare and random and that can have small effects on the traits, mutants will displace residents, and the evolutionary dynamics will climb up the slope of the fitness landscape and eventually equilibrate at the point which is convergence stable if the derivative of this function here with respect to the resident value is negative. So this defines a convergence stable strategy with this, which is different than a local ESS. A local ESS, you additionally requires that the second order derivative of the payoff function is negative. So what we are interested here is convergence stable point. They are the attractor points of the evolutionary dynamics when you have small mutant effects on the trait. These were the ideas developed by Eschel, Metz and colleagues. They developed this very, very generally, where you can have very complicated environments. There is no need that the environment is really at an equilibrium. It could be at an attractor point of a dynamical system that could be a cycle or a strange attractor. The bottom line in all this literature, it's that it's always the direct effects on fitness, somehow how my increase in fitness or my own payoff drives the evolutionary dynamics. And what we want to do is to basically keep this setting of socially mediated environmental interaction, but put the model in a structured population where you have limited dispersal between groups, but also where you have finite total population size. So this result here is a standard result for panmictic population when everybody moves randomly in the population, which really describes the situation of this starting graph. And we want to do this for a population that is of finite size, and I should emphasize that the standard story, the population is of infinite size. We want to do this for a population of finite size where individuals live in small patches and they are connected to migration to other patches. And where the geographic distance within patches may affect how you move between them. So let me explain the model, the assumptions behind the model. So there is a total number of patches, D. So this is the number of patches in the population. And all these patches, they contain exactly n adult individuals. So we have a population consisting of patches, and these patches, they are arranged homogeneously in the habitat. So basically the set of patches forms an additive group of integers. So basically for this talk, it's good to remind that this is either, you can think of this as a circle, so patches, they are arranged on a circle, or in 2-dimension in a torus. So basically we impose periodic boundaries. Another way to think of the model is actually that you have like clans, they are in tribes are in communities are in state. This would also be covered by the model. So you have these patches that are homogeneously located in the habitat, and then you have migration between these patches. So meaning that individuals, they can either stay in the place where they were born, or they can migrate. And the migration distribution is arbitrary. So you may tend to have localized migration instead of global migration. If your chance of migration was equal to any patch, to any location of the habitat, if it was a uniform random distribution, then you would actually recover a panmictic population. But we impose here some limited dispersion, and then in each patch we have the environmental variables. So to each patch we have an amount of grass. And the model, what the model will assume is demographic time. So basically the updating events between reproduction and survival is discrete in time. So we can think of this as a cultural evolution model. So when individuals, they update their strategies, they may copy neighbors. So the model applies also to certain scenarios of cultural evolution, but in a discrete time updating process. And each individual in this population expresses the quantitative traits we are interested in. And the assumption we make is that both the survival and the reproduction of each individual can be affected by its own trait value, and possibly that by any other individual in the population located at a different place in the habitat. There is a stage of dispersal. Dispersal may actually be affected by the evolving traits, but after dispersal, you have density-dependent regulation. So in a sense, the population is always kept at constant size over one iteration of the life cycle, where you have survival, reproduction, dispersal, and then regulation back to a constant population size. And then we have environmental dynamics. The environmental dynamics in each patch that can be affected by any individual in the population. And the main assumption we make is that all these effects, they are spatially homogeneous. They only depend on the relative distance between patches, but not on the exact spatial location of the patches. So I think this figure will help to explain exactly what the model is about and how the assumptions are built in. So we have here a focal patch taken arbitrary to be located at the position 0 in the habitat, and we have a focal individual that expresses the trait value, and the payoff to this individual, which is here, that depends on its trait value, necessarily on its trait value, and possibly on the average trait value of individuals residing in any other patch of the population. So these are these arrows here. Individuals, they can affect my payoff, and so we have a vector here of average traits that lists these traits of individuals residing in the different patches. The payoff, my payoff, can also depend on the value, the state variable, the amount of grass or the amount of pollutants there is at each location of the habitat. So the payoff here depends on a vector of environmental variables taken at each location of the habitat. So you see this model, in a sense, it's like a multidimensional version of the panmictic population model that I presented before, where my payoff was depending on my trait and the average trait among neighbors. Here, the neighbors actually consist of individuals residing at a different location of the habitat, and the environmental state variable can take different values at the different location of the habitat. And then my payoff, that will determine my fitness. But the relationship between payoff and fitness is not so straightforward in a spatially structured population, because it depends on the movement of individual. And later I will present you a specific example of this fitness function, of the relationship between fitness and payoff, and this matters for the results. And what is important here is that the value of the state variable in the focal patch, that depends on the trait value the average trait value among individuals in the previous generation. So here I have this subscript T here that denotes for time backwards. So basically the state variable in the focal patch at some arbitrary time taken 0, that depends on the vector of average trait value in all patches of the population at the previous time step, and possibly at the value of the environmental state variable at each previous time point. And this map is homogeneous, so in a sense you can think of this as a Markov process. So you could iterate in a sense backwards, which means that you can think of the phenotype of an individual as depending on the history, on the whole history of trait expression and environmental state dynamics in the past of the population. Okay, so this defines the model, and let me emphasize again that we assume that these effects, they are spatially homogeneous. So the absolute position in space does not matter, it's only the relative distance. So these guys here, they may have a stronger influence than these guys here. We may have a distribution of effects, but this distribution of effects is the same at all locations of the habitat. Are we clear? Is this clear? Okay, good. So this defines the biological assumption of the model. So we don't make more detailed assumption about the model. This can incorporate the standard Wright-Fisher process of reproduction, right, where everybody dies in a generation, and then our juveniles compete for vacant breeding spots, or Moran process type of updatings, where you have one individual that is killed per generation and then is replaced, or any mixture between the two, where individuals, they have independent survival probabilities from one generation to the next. I see that there are questions. I mean, no, it's no.
I could ask a question. So
Yes.
you say that at the end of each generation, basically every locus would have like n individuals, but then there is this, but they move around, right?
Exactly. So if the population has n individual, has in each patch you have n individuals, and then you have
but after moving, you might end up with a patch which has 0 individuals.
No. So this is, if you want this, the updating rule is such that you always have exactly the same amount of individuals in each patch. So the typical process is like this. All adult individuals reproduce. They produce a large number of offspring, let's say Poisson distributed number of offspring, each adult. Then all adults die. Each offspring randomly chooses a patch to migrate on. And so then you have aspiring individuals, offspring in a certain patch, and you cull them down to n individuals. So if you assume that the mean of the Poisson distribution is large, you will always, I mean, technically you should say infinite number of offspring, which is what all these models usually do. Then all patches will be exactly filled with n adults. Another example is really Moran process, where one individual is killed per generation, but everybody reproduces and they just send immigrants. So in that sense, everything is homogeneous. The population patches are homogeneous. They are same. Individuals are the same. The only difference is actually that they can have different traits. And what we want to do is an evolutionary invasion analysis on this. So what we postulate is that mutations are rare. So the population arrives at an equilibrium, and then we introduce a small mutant in this population. So we have a population that expresses resident trait value Z, such that everybody has this trait value at some moment in time. And the assumption we make, this is maybe an important assumption, is that when everybody has the same trait value, we assume that there is an equilibrium to the environmental dynamics that is the same in each patch. This is sometimes called a homogeneous or flat solution. So basically, there is a hyperbolically stable fixed point of the environmental dynamics. So to each trait value, for each given resident trait value, the environmental dynamics converges to some equilibrium. That could be a certain amount of public good produced, that could be a certain amount of grass, or a level of pollutants that is characterized by the resident population, and then it's the same in each batch. So in a resident population, everything looks the same from everywhere. It's totally isotropic. And then we introduce in this population a mutant, a small mutant that deviates with magnitude delta in its phenotype. This is really invasion analysis. We have the resident trait value or type Z. We introduce a mutant Z plus delta. And then our measure of evolutionary success is the fixation probability of this mutant, since we assume that mutations are very rare. So this is what we want to. Sorry, I realized I skipped a graph. I should be explaining this graph. Sorry. So we introduce a single mutant with trait value Z plus delta into the population monomorphic for the resident trait, and aims to compute its fixation probability. If the fixation probability of the mutant increases relative to the resident, then over the long term of the process, we are more likely to observe this type. So for a population like this, where you have rare mutants that arise from time to time, but the process goes on forever, but mutants are sufficiently large, sufficiently rare that you always have only two types in the population, then a measure of the convergence stability of the trait value is obtained from the perturbation of the fixation probability of the mutant that should be equal to 0. So we have this complicated object that is the fixation probability of the mutant, and then we evaluate the derivative of this fixation probability and evaluate this at the resident population. So this measure here, that depends only on the resident trait. And the resident trait Z star that nullifies this function, this is a candidate evolutionary stable point, and it's convergent stable if the derivative of this function is equal to 0. One way to think about this is actually to think really about the long term of the process, that you enter in a stationary phenotypic distribution, and you look at the maximum of this distribution. And so a local maximum of this stationary phenotypic distribution, this is characterized by this condition, basically that the perturbation of the fixation probability is equal to 0. So we take the perturbation of the fixation probability as a measure of the selection gradient, and this was really introduced into a game theory setting by Rousset and Billiard. This has long been used in population genetics for non-game theory, if you want, for non-frequency dependent interaction consideration, and Rousset and Billiard introduced this measure of convergence stability basically at the turn of the century. So this is what we want to
ask a clarification question.
Yes.
So these mutations are always local. So you cannot have somebody come up with a very different mutation. I mean, like my understanding is that the mutants have a trait value very close to the original trait value.
Exactly. This is because absolutely. This is really absolutely. This is really, if you want, this is really the way we construct the model is really in terms of biology, gradual evolution, right? I mean, we think we are Darwinian here. We think Darwin is small mutation with small phenotypic effects, so that you can evolve by basically random mutation and cumulative natural selection. Exactly. We don't allow for large. Then the measure of convergence stability would be more complicated.
Okay, thank you.
They actually would be, you would not be able to solve anything, because even the simplest panmictic population model, it's very difficult to compute things with this. Take a Moran process, you will not be able to solve it explicitly, the fixation probability in a population with a limited dispersal. You can only do this because you have closed form solution only for birth and death process, only in panmictic populations. So absolutely. In a sense, we could say we are based on biology. I mean, it's really one of the main empirical findings of biology is basically two things. There are two things. Populations are structured, they exhibit limited dispersal, and mutation have weak phenotypic effects. I mean, you have really, I mean, basically have a century of work of knockouts or mutation. It's not that it's impossible to have a large mutation effect, but the bulk of mutations, they are distributed around the parental phenotype. And this is the assumption we make. Okay. So then the way, I will not go too much into the mathematical details, but I will just explain one thing we do because it helps to explain the result to compute this fixation probability perturbation. So the way we think about this is we think about the probability of fixation of the mutant at this asymptotic average frequency. So you can think of the fixation probability as the expectation of the frequency of the average frequency at time t of the mutant when t goes to infinity. So this is one definition actually of the fixation probability. So conditional on the resident trait value being z and the initial frequency of the mutant being 1 over total population number. So here is actually a typo I should have replaced by 1 divided by nd. Then the fixation probability of the single mutant is the expectation of the frequency in the long term. And this you can express as sum of changes at each time point. And so the way we compute the fixation probability is as the derivative of the one-step changes in mutant frequencies. So we take the derivative of the expected one step change in allele frequency. So here you could actually recognize that's a form of that will take the form of a replicator equation. If we were to crank in fitness, that would be basically the condition on the population state at some point in time, and then you apply the replicator equation over one time step, and you perturb this. And because we're looking only to first order effects, we have to compute this perturbation at delta is equal to 0, so in a resident population. And so that means that the expectation of the process is sufficiently evaluated at delta is equal to 0, basically in a resident population. So this is kind of important. This is a very useful trick. So we look at the perturbation of fitness, but we evaluate all stochastic effects that are driven by the process. They are evaluated in a resident population. So for those who have never seen this is a little bit analogous, conceptually speaking, as to the perturbation of an eigenvalue. If you perturb an eigenvalue, eigenvalue is an operator that maps you a population state to next. If you perturb an eigenvalue, you hold the left and right eigenvectors fixed at the unperturbed state. Right? So somehow all the information about the distribution of states is on the unperturbed process. And this is here what is assumed. And as I said, we assume that there is a hyperbolically stable fixed point in the resident population. So this is the way we compute it. And now to go to the results, I have to introduce a series of quantities. By the way, how much time do I have left?
You're 35 minutes in.
I'm 35 minutes in, okay. Okay, so to present the results, I need the fitness function. fitness function of an individual that could take many different forms, but for the example, I will sometimes present graphs. I will take basically a Wright-Fisher process with survival. That's sometimes called a Cunning's process. So an individual, he has a certain probability of survival S, and then he produces offspring, and how many offspring you put at the different spatial location where you can migrate. So the individual produces offspring, his offspring can migrate to any spatial location. That depends on the migration distribution, and how many offspring it produces depends on its payoff. That depends on the environmental state variable. That depends on the relative success at each spatial position, which depends on all the immigrant offspring that are aspiring to this spot. So if S was equal to 1 minus 1 over total population size, this would be a Moran process. So if you put here in front 1 over total population size, then you get the Moran process. But the example we will work with, they assume S is equal to 0, so all individuals dies, because you will see we will look at effects on the future when an individual is basically dead, and so the Wright-Fisher would implement this. And although this is not central to this talk, but this notation here R means that we compute the average trait value of an individual in its patch. So the focal individual, he's a proportion 1 over n in its patch. So this means sampling individuals with replacement, and this matters for the evolutionary dynamics, because if you send offspring to a certain location, these offspring, they may be in competition from offspring coming from your patch, and in your patch you have affected individuals neighbors. So this will affect the fitness of others. Okay, so we have a payoff function, we have a fitness function, and we have an environmental map. And now I need to introduce the main quantity that will define the results, and this is the relatedness coefficient. And so to introduce the relatedness coefficient, I will introduce this QKT, which is the stationary probability of identity by descent between a pair of genes sampled at spatial distance k and t time steps apart. So to understand this, think of the process occurring over different generations. So you have like individuals, and they have their dynasties, they have descendants far into the future, maybe 100 generations later, and you pick an individual, you pick a focal individual, and then you look at another individual, maybe 10 or 100 generations later, at a certain spatial position, and then you ask, what's the probability that these two individuals share genes identical by descent? And this is what this stationary probability of identity gives. And this is evaluated in the presence of mutation. So now, if you have a process in a finite population, you let him run long enough, this will go to 1 in the long term, because everybody will become identical. So everybody will have the same alleles in the long run if you suppresses the mutation rate. However, we have this limit, this relatedness, which is the difference between the probability, the relatedness between two individuals, one sampled at a, say, focal position, and the other k steps apart on the lattice at t time in the future. This is then equal, this is defined as the difference between the probability of identity by descent between these two individuals and the average in the population at that time, relative to the difference between 1 and the average probability in the focal generation. So this relatedness coefficient, it measures the excess of identity between two individuals sampled at a certain space-time position. They measure how much they are more likely to carry the same alleles in a neutral process in the resident population than are individuals at average in the population. And this will be non-zero as soon as migration is not uniformly random in the population. And here I've depicted some figures. So typically the shape of relatedness is like this in the focal generation, like say you take individuals in the same generation contemporaries, so they are positively related at close spatial position, but they become negatively related at further apart. And as time goes by, they are less related locally because genes diffuse in space. So you are less likely to find the same, let's say, a descendant 10 generations from here in your same village. And so that means the distribution flatten out as time goes by. And if you wait infinite amount of time, then it will be totally uniformly distributed in the population. This is a 2D description of this relatedness. So this is really a bimodal distribution. You can think as a two-dimensional bivariate distribution with positive relatedness close to the focal position and negative relatedness farther apart. So quantity three, scaled relatedness. So scaled relatedness, this is a bit complicated, but this will be the main quantity in which the results will be expressed. This is a measure of relatedness which rescales the original relatedness. So the original relatedness, let me just go back the slide here. This original relatedness, you can think of this as a marginal substitution rate between the fitness of an individual and a recipient of its action. So you can really think of relatedness as how many units of fitness I'm willing to exchange for the individual living at this spatial position KT from now. So it's a measure of the genetic value of the recipients of the traits of an individual. If relatedness is 0, you cannot be altruistic because that means your marginal substitution rate is 0. If relatedness is positive, you are willing to exchange some units of fitness for the individual living at this spatial position. The issue under spatial structured population is that by helping a neighbor, you may actually hurt another neighbor that is related to you because you put its offspring in competition with the offspring of the other. And so this is why we define this scaled relatedness coefficients, which takes into account how the fitness of an individual depends on the payoff of others. So the scaled relatedness coefficient depends on this measure of coefficient of fitness interdependence, which measures how much my fitness varies when the payoff of a neighbor is varied relative to my own payoff variation. So in a panmictic population, this is typically 0 because we don't have fitness interdependence at the payoff level. But in a structured population, these coefficients, they tend to be positive because individuals from the same location, they will compete for the same resources. And so we use these coefficients of fitness interdependence to rescale relatedness, so they will be typically positive, to rescale relatedness and to take into account that when I'm affecting the trait of a given recipient, it may actually hurt another individual to which the relatedness coefficient I'm interested in. And so the scaled relatedness coefficient, the way to think intuitively about them is as marginal substitution rate at the payoff level. In fact, what the scaled relatedness coefficient give is how much units of payoff an individual is willing to exchange to give payoffs to another individual here in the model, to the individual living at the position K, t times in the future. Okay, with this, and then I need the fourth quantity because it's complicated. This model has many elements. So the fourth quantity is the extended phenotypic effect of an individual. So we formalize the extended phenotypic effect of an individual is the change. It's the change in the environmental state variable in the future. So an individual lives in the present, but he may change in the far future at time t, at position k. He may change the value of the state variable as a result of its own behavior, and we define the extended phenotypic effect of an individual as the derivative of the change of the state variable with respect to the individual changing its state value. So like you emit more pollutant, how much will this affect the environmental at the spatial position in the future? And the way you can affect the environment is the future is actually by perturbing the environmental dynamics, the environmental map in your patch or in other patches. Here I've described this for the focal patch. So this is this coefficient phi. An individual is disturbing the environmental dynamics. He puts, let's say, pollutant where he eats more resources. So he's affecting, he has an effect on the environmental dynamics. And then this environmental dynamics, it may through the dynamics, it may ratchet down, it may have cascading effects downstream the generation to eventually affect the state variable at time t in the focal patch, and where these C coefficients, they are perturbations of the environmental dynamics with respect to changing these variables. And so that means that we can compute these extended phenotypic effects using Fourier transform. So I will not go into the details, but this is a thing we do a lot in the paper. We are able to express the quantities in terms of Fourier transform, and then we can compute them. And so this pathway, which may be complicated in a spatial environment, explicit environment, because you can have diffusion of the public goods through space, you can compute these effects, how an individual impact the environment of basically future generations. So you can ascribe future effects to the present expression of the action. And so in terms of these quantity, I arrive at the central result of the paper, which is basically a representation of the selection gradient on the traits in a spatially structured population that consists of these three terms. So I will walk you through each of these terms, and I will start by forgetting about this term here and just focusing on this here. So this is the derivative of the payoff of the focal individual with respect to its trait change. So if the population was completely panmictic, all these terms would vanish, and this would determine the direction of selection on the trait and would be sufficient to characterize convergence stability of the quantitative trait. And this is exactly the result that I started with this presentation by showing the characterization of convergence stability in a panmictic population. Assuming there are no environmentally mediated social interaction, but all the interactions are direct, then we have this term here, which actually for a focal individual weights all possible recipients of its action, which basically takes the genetic value of all possible recipients of its action and takes into account the effect of the focal on the payoff of these individuals. So you can think of this sum, you can interpret this sum as the sum of the effect of an individual on all others at each spatial position. So you go through the circle. So I count every individual that can be the recipient of my action. I look at what's my effect on their payoff, and I weight them by the genetic values. All right? So for a given model, we can compute this coefficient of scale relatedness, and we would recover many results of the literature. So there are many results of evolutionary graph theory that gives you condition for the spread, for the spread of traits for cooperation or so, and we would recover all these results by, given the life cycle assumption, computing the appropriate scaled relatedness coefficients. The novel thing of our model is really this sum here, which is the sum over all times of the effect of individuals on the future environmental state and how this affects the genetic relatives at all future times. So it's a sum over all time, over all spatial positions of the genetic value of individuals. So again, we take the focal individual. He may affect each individual whose value is given by the scale coefficient. And the way he affects these individuals is by perturbing the environmental state there. And the environmental state there, it may have an effect on the payoff of these individuals that is given by these derivatives. So we need to sum the total effects. We need to take into account the effect of the individual on all possible environmental states at all positions of the habitat, and then weight these by how the change of the environmental state variable affects the payoff of the individuals. And so we have this double sum here. And so this gives us now a way to understand natural selection in terms of the future consequences of present phenotypic effects. No? And if there was no space or no effect on the future, this term would cancel. But as soon as you have limited dispersal and you can affect the future environments, then this effect will become positive and matter for natural selection. So what this equation says is, it says you can be long dead, but still your phenotypic effects be under natural selection. You can really have the evolution of posthumous altruism or spiteful behavior, where you can have an effect that costs you in the present, but that ratchet down in the future of the population. So this is really the main message, conceptual message of this result, is that natural selection can target phenotypic effect far beyond the physical position where individuals live. But this, in a sense, is not new. This is really Dawkins' extended phenotypic effect, but also possibly 100 generations away from where an individual live. So with this, I will present an example to the evolution of spite. So how much time do I have left?
You're 53 minutes in, so depending on how much discussion you want, it can be, yeah. So
I can stop here, or I can present the example.
I think it's useful to present the example.
Okay, then let me present the example. So for the example, what we assume is a much simplified model. We basically assume that the payoff of an individual, that depends on, he expresses a trait. So it's individually costly, like in the many models for the evolution of cooperation. So you can think of this as a model for the evolution of cooperation, if you would like. So he pays a cost and he gets some benefit that depends on the amount of the state variable in its patch. And the state variable, that changes according to some dynamics, and that can diffuse in space. So the way the state variable changes, this is the value of the state variable in the focal patch that depends on the distribution of phenotypes in the population and state variable. So basically we have with a certain probability, the variable, let's say it's a pollutant, it does not disperse, it stays there. Then it has a certain rate of decay, depending on how much pollutant there was there in the past, plus individual adds an amount of pollutant depending on the trait value, and then you have an inflow of the pollutant coming from all spatial position that depends on the dispersal distribution and the amount that has not decayed that was there at the previous time points, plus the input of individual in this pollutants. And so the way we parameterize the model, we were interested in knowing when you would have public good production versus public bad. We let the trait Z vary between basically minus infinity and plus infinity. When it's positive, it's a public good. So basically the trait is altruistic. So if Z is positive, N will become positive. And if Z is negative, you basically produce a public bad, a pollutant. And then the question is, what is the value of Z that will evolve? Will it become positive or will it become negative? So this is basically the model where the distribution of the focal species, the migration distribution is arbitrary. Also here we assume this distribution could take any form. So this is the model. And then for this model, we find that there is a unique convergent stable trait value that is defined by this equation. Maybe I should not go too much into the details of the parameter, but what is important, it depends on this omega. So basically, these are the cost and benefit parameters that shape how concave the cost and benefit function is. But what matters here is this omega, because this omega can be either positive, in which case you have production of public good and individuals become altruistic, or can be negative, in which case you have production of public bad and individuals become spiteful. And the interesting thing is that this omega, it can be thought, in fact, as the average genetic value over all spatial position and future times of the population of the probability that an individual that resides at this spatial position experiences a unit of this good produced by focal individuals. So Q key T, that's the distribution of immortal unit of public good, the probability that when it's created in the present, it's in the patch K at time T in the future. So in fact, all this is the probability that the unit of public good will be at this position, because this takes into account this 1 minus epsilon t minus 1, that it's not decayed. So this is really the probability here that the unit of good or bad produced is at the spatial position kt, in which case it matters for the focal individual if depending on the scaled relatedness coefficient. So this, you can really think of this as an average extended phenotypic effect weighted by the value, the genetic value of such effect on the lineage of individuals emanating from a focal individual expressing the trait value in the present. And to understand, it's not clear from this equation whether when this will be positive or negative. So to understand this, one can rewrite this actually as a covariance, as a sum over all time of a covariance between two distributions, basically the distribution of the public good and the dispersal distribution. So this PT here, that's the probability that the line of descent of genes from the focal individual are at the spatial position K at time T. And so if there is a covariance in these two distributions, so you can think of these two distributions as basically random walks, one for the gene lineage, the other for the public good. And so what this covariance tells us is that if there is a covariance between where these distributions go, then omega will be positive, and then the trait will be positively selected. However, when you have a negative covariance, then you will have evolution of, then it can be negative and you can have evolution of spite. So the question then is, when can this covariance be negative? And to find condition about this, we assumed a binomial distribution of distance of dispersal. So basically what we assumed is that individuals have a certain probability of moving out of the patch, and when they move out of the patch, they have a binomial distribution of dispersal. So if you tend to have short range dispersal, this is the focal patch, and then your distance of dispersal would be binomially distributed. And if you have short range dispersal, then you will be clumped over the patch where you are born, where this is space. Under long range dispersal, you tend to disperse far away, and then the typical dispersal distribution would be like this, where you have few individuals in neighboring patches, but a lot, not few individuals. The probability that you go in a neighboring patch is low, but you have a high chance to going in a patch far away. So basically you have a two clumped distribution, the short range distribution and long range distribution. And we assume this for both individuals of the focal species and the goods and the environment they affects. And this will make the difference between altruism and spite. So assuming these distribution, if we have a long-range distribution of this person, then the extended phenotypic effects under long-range dispersal, they are typically like this. Now you see the effects, they are like, that means that you put a lot of public bad around this patch, which characterize the mean dispersal distance. You can take at this peak at the mean dispersal distance. So this is where you put, in fact, the public bad under these assumptions. So when you increase the production of the public bad, this is the distribution where it will be located. And as time passes by, this flattens, because the public bad is moving in space according to this distribution. And since it moves far away, the public bad that is here, it will come back to the focal patch. So that's why at the second generation, it's peaked on the focal patch. But since the distribution is the same as all time, you see that then it flattens out. And what this means is that for at least several t, we can have a negative covariance if we assume that the dispersal of the focal species is peaked on the focal patch. If you have a short range dispersal for this focal species, but long range dispersal of the public good, then you will have this asymmetry of public good and gene lineages, meaning that the toxic compounds you are producing in the habitat, they will be felt by individuals from different gene lineages, and this can favor then the evolution of spite. So the condition for spite, we find that they occur if you have strong movement of the focal species or the commons in the habitat, when you have fast environmental decay, so that basically the pollutant you put in the habitat, they don't come back to you, they don't last long enough to come back to you, to the focal patch, and there is an asymmetry in the distance of dispersal. I will not go into the details of this graph, but this is basically what they show. They are these conditions where you will have evolution of spite. When spite does not evolve, then it's altruism that evolves, basically production of public good. And this we checked that our results agree with individual-based simulation, where we really implemented the process assuming not too small mutation rates, so that we're a little bit outside the strict assumption under which our model was derived, where we really assumed complete separation of time scale between mutants and the invasion process. And usually we find that there is an excellent agreement between the prediction of our model and the evolutionary dynamics. So this is a graph where you have the evolution of spite. So initially you have no investment into spite, and as time passes by, the trait evolves, as well as the public, as well as the good in the population, and that converges to the evolutionary, to the convergent stable trait value predicted by the analytical model. And here, this is the same for this graph here. So basically, let me come to the conclusion of this model. The first conclusion is that we basically derived a representation of the selection gradient for socially mediated interaction under isolation by distance that is actually tractable. We can really do calculation and do concrete examples of the model. And this is really due to the fact that we assume that the map, the environmental dynamics, is deterministic. So there is a general representation of the selection gradient under any process, under any stochastic process that goes back to Ronce and Rousset in spatially structured population, but this had few application because usually you have problems of the curse of dimensionality where you have to solve for all the environmental states that are very complicated. And so what our paper shows is that if you assume this deterministic environmental map, you have a hope of solving the problem, at least doing calculation. And this is interesting because it really allows you then to do ecological model in space where you may have interaction between environmental different environmental state variables. So all our results, they apply to the case where you have like n environmental state variables. And so basically you can affect the evolution of a whole ecosystem. Second conclusion is how an individual values others at different spatial position of the habitat and at future times is given by the scaled relatedness coefficient. You can really think of this as a measure of value of others, as an exchange coefficient. How much payoff are you willing to exchange to give to an individual at that space-time coordinate? And finally, the third conclusion is that we have an example of indiscriminate spite that show that this behavior can evolve. So previous models about the evolution of spite, they assumed recognition between individual discrimination. So they are all based on a kin discrimination mechanism. And I think that we have the first example actually of the evolution of strong spite, of a strong spiteful behavior that is indiscriminate and that can evolve by natural selection. So by strong spite, I really mean a behavior that decreases the fitness of the actor. So you had previous models of spite by Hamilton, Schaffer, but they were all models of weak spite, where actually the individual benefited from its own action, whether we have a case where it's individually costly and it's indiscriminate. There is no recognition mechanism. It's indiscriminate relatives to which individuals are targeted. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, Lauren. Lauren, I will stop the recording and the floor.